I came home a day early. That was the only reason any of this happened. If my flight had landed on schedule, if the meeting in Chicago had run its usual course, if I hadn't decided at the last minute to skip the client dinner and catch the red-eye back, none of it would have unraveled the way it did. But life has a way of pulling the thread you least expect, and once it starts, there is no stopping what unravels. My name is Diane. I'm 43 years old. I run a mid-sized consulting firm that keeps me traveling more than I'd like, and I live alone in a high-rise apartment in the kind of city that never really goes quiet. I've built everything I have from scratch: the career, the apartment, the reputation. What I hadn't built, not successfully anyway, was a family. My marriage to Robert ended 6 years ago, quietly and without much drama, the way things end when two people simply grow into strangers while sharing the same address. We had no children together, but Robert had a son from his first relationship, a boy named Carter, who was 11 when I entered his life and 17 when I left it. Except I never really left. Carter and I had built something real during those years, something that survived the divorce, survived the awkward holidays and the split loyalties and the slow erosion of what his father and I once had. He called me every few weeks. He visited when he could. He was 23 now, living across town, finishing his graduate degree in architecture, and still showing up at my door the way he always had, unannounced, easy, like no time had passed at all. I loved him the way you love someone who grew up partly because of you. Not as a mother exactly, but as something close to it. Something that didn't have a clean name but felt just as permanent. I need you to hold on to that before I tell you what happened. Because what I'm about to share with you doesn't make me look good. It doesn't tie up neatly. And if you're the kind of person who needs the people in a story to be entirely innocent or entirely guilty, this might frustrate you. But if you're willing to sit with something complicated, something that cracked me open and changed everything I thought I understood about myself, then stay with me. Because this story starts the night I came home a day early and found Carter in my living room with a woman named Jade. And it ends somewhere I never could have predicted. The elevator in my building has always been slow. I've lived there 4 years and I've never once taken the stairs, which means I've spent more time than I'd like to admit standing in that mirrored box, watching the numbers climb. That night, I barely noticed the ride up. I was exhausted in the particular way that only travel exhaustion can produce, not sleepy exactly, but hollowed out, like someone had scooped all the substance from behind my eyes and left only the weight of the day pressing down on my shoulders. I had my roller bag. My laptop case. A paper bag with a salad I'd picked up from the place on the corner, knowing my fridge would be empty. I was thinking about a hot shower and nothing else. The corridor was dark when I stepped out. I'd left the lamp on in the living room before I left, I always do, but the light coming under my door was different. Flickering. The blue-gray pulse of a television screen. My first thought was that I'd left the TV on. My second thought arrived about 2 seconds later, when I heard a sound from inside the apartment. Quiet. Barely there. But enough. I stood at my door with my key in my hand and I didn't move for a long moment. There was no reason to be afraid. I knew that. The building was secure, Carter had a spare key, and the most logical explanation was already forming in my mind before I'd finished processing the situation. He told me once that he sometimes used my place when I was traveling, to study, he'd said, somewhere quieter than his shared apartment across town. I'd told him that was fine. I'd meant it. I turned the key and opened the door. The living room was mostly dark, the television casting its shifting light across the furniture, and it took my eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, I understood immediately that what I was looking at was not studying. Carter was on the couch. He's tall, always has been, even as a teenager, the kind of tall that fills a doorframe, and in that moment his size felt amplified somehow, his frame curved over the woman beneath him. She had dark hair that spilled across the cushion, her face tilted upward, her eyes closed. One of her hands was pressed flat against his chest. The other was buried in his hair. They hadn't heard me come in. I should have made a sound. I should have cleared my throat or set my bag down or said his name. I know that. But I stood there in the doorway with my key still in my hand, and for several seconds I simply could not make myself move. It wasn't shock, exactly. Or it wasn't only shock. There was something else happening in my body in those seconds, something that started low in my chest and moved outward, warm and disorienting, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to understand what it was. The woman was beautiful. That was the first clear thought I managed. Not the way Carter was beautiful, openly, boyishly, with that easy confidence he'd carried since adolescence. She was beautiful the way certain paintings are beautiful, quietly and with precision, like every line of her face had been placed with intention. Her lips were slightly parted. Her lashes were dark against her cheek. She made a small sound, almost inaudible, and my grip on my key tightened without my permission. Then my roller bag slipped from my hand and hit the floor. The sound was not loud, but in the stillness of the apartment it landed like a gunshot. Carter's head came up. For a fraction of a second his expression was completely unguarded, startled, young, caught entirely off guard, and then it rearranged itself into something between relief and mortification. Diane. He sat up quickly. I thought you weren't back until tomorrow. The woman, Jade, though I didn't know her name yet, pulled herself upright with a quiet, practiced composure that impressed me despite everything. She reached for the throw blanket at the end of the couch and wrapped it around herself, not frantically but calmly, and when she looked at me her expression was steady. There was embarrassment in it, but no panic. Just a kind of measured stillness that I found, in that strange suspended moment, oddly arresting. I caught an earlier flight, I said. My voice came out more even than I felt. I didn't think I needed to announce myself in my own apartment. No, Carter said immediately. Of course not. Diane, I'm sorry. We weren't expecting. It's fine, I said. And I meant it, mostly. The part one wasn't prepared to examine was something else entirely. I'll give you a minute. I'm going to get changed. I picked up my bag. I walked down the hall. I closed my bedroom door behind me and stood with my back against it in the dark. My heart was doing something it had no business doing. I want to be honest with you, because that's the whole point of telling this. What I felt standing in that doorway was not simply the surprise of finding someone in my apartment. It wasn't maternal concern or step-parent protectiveness or any of the things I might have told myself at the time. What I felt was something much more inconvenient. Something that had no reasonable explanation and no clean place to go. I was drawn to her. To Jade. To the way she looked lying there, to the sound she had made, to the composure with which she'd met my eyes in the aftermath. It was immediate and it was undeniable and it made absolutely no sense, and I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time trying to convince myself it was simply the disorientation of travel, the strangeness of the moment, the way the mind reaches for the wrong things when it's tired. By the time I heard the front door close and the apartment go quiet, I still hadn't convinced myself of anything. Now, before I go any further, I want to ask you something. If you've ever felt a pull toward someone you had no right to feel anything for, if you've ever stood in the wreckage of your own certainty and wondered how you got there, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now and leave me a comment below telling me what you did with that feeling. Did you run from it? Did you follow it? Did it cost you something? Because this community is built on honest conversation, and what I'm about to tell you next is going to need that kind of honesty. Stay with me. I didn't see Jade again for 11 days. In that time I thought about her more than I would like to admit. Not obsessively, or at least I told myself it wasn't obsessive, but with the persistent low-grade distraction of someone trying not to think about something. I'd be in a meeting and find my attention drifting. I'd be reading before bed and realize I'd turned 4 pages without absorbing a word. It was inconvenient and irritating, and I kept filing it under exhaustion, stress, the general disarray of a busy life. Carter texted me the morning after, apologetic and a little sheepish. I told him again that it was fine and I meant it, and we made plans for dinner the following week the way we always did, easy and uncomplicated. He mentioned Jade's name in passing, told me she was a painter, that they'd been together for about 8 months, that she was probably going to come to the dinner too if that was okay with me. I said of course it was. I told myself I was fine. Then on a Thursday evening, I found myself at a gallery opening in the Arts District, the kind of event I attend more out of obligation than genuine enthusiasm, all white walls and expensive wine and people talking about brushwork with an intensity that makes you feel like you've missed something fundamental about how to be a person. I was standing in front of a large abstract canvas, something in shades of rust and charcoal that I couldn't entirely decode but felt something about, when I heard a voice behind me. Most people stand too close to that one. I turned around. Jade was standing 2 feet away from me, holding a glass of white wine, wearing a dark green dress that made her look like she'd been assembled specifically to be looked at. Her hair was down. She was watching me with an expression that wasn't quite a smile but contained all the warmth of one. Jade, I said, because her name was suddenly the only word available to me. Diane. A real smile now, small and careful. I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to see you either. We stood there for a moment in the specific awkwardness of 2 people who share an uncomfortable first memory and aren't sure yet how to build past it. Then Jade tilted her head slightly toward the painting. If you stand back about 4 more steps, the whole thing changes. It stops being chaos and starts being intentional. I stepped back. She was right. From a distance the canvas resolved into something almost architectural, the rust shapes became light, the charcoal became depth, and what had looked like randomness revealed itself as a kind of careful order. How did you know that? I asked. I paint, she said simply. We talked for 2 hours. I don't know how else to explain it except to say that the conversation had a quality I hadn't experienced in a long time, the feeling of speaking to someone who is genuinely listening, not waiting for their turn, not constructing their response while you're still forming yours, but actually receiving what you say and turning it over before they answer. She asked me about my work with real curiosity. She talked about her own with a self-deprecating honesty that was more compelling than any amount of confidence would have been. She told me she'd been painting since she was 7 years old and that she still woke up every morning uncertain whether she was any good, and that the uncertainty was the part she'd learned to stop fighting. Fighting it makes it louder, she said. Living with it makes it smaller. At some point the gallery began to thin out, the overhead lights brightening slightly the way they do when an event is winding down. Jade looked at her wine glass, then at me, and said a group of people were heading to a rooftop bar nearby and I was welcome to come along. I said yes before I'd finished deciding. The rooftop was one of those places that makes you feel briefly like the city exists for you specifically, high enough that the noise is muffled, low enough that you can still see the movement of it below, all lit windows and headlights tracing slow patterns through the streets. We ended up at a corner table away from the rest of the group, which had dissolved naturally into its own conversations, and the city spread out around us like something private. I don't know exactly when the conversation shifted. It happened gradually, the way temperature changes, you don't notice until you're already somewhere different from where you started. We were talking about loneliness. Not dramatically, not in the way people perform loneliness for sympathy, but plainly and almost technically, the way you talk about something you've examined enough to no longer be ashamed of. Jade said she sometimes felt lonely even with Carter. Not because of anything he'd done wrong, she was careful to say that, and I believed her, but because there was a part of herself that she hadn't found a way to translate into the language of their relationship. Something she kept folding up and putting away. What kind of something? I asked. She looked at me for a moment before she answered. The city lights caught the edge of her face, and I was aware, in a way that was becoming harder to be casual about, of how close we were sitting. The kind you can't explain without it sounding like a complaint, she said finally. When it isn't one. Her fingers were resting on the table between us. At some point mine had come to rest nearby, not touching, but close enough that the proximity felt deliberate. Neither of us moved. I think I understand that, I said quietly. I meant it in the generic way you mean things when you're trying to be empathetic. But when she looked at me, something in her expression suggested she was hearing something more specific, and I didn't correct her. I let it sit between us and I didn't correct it. We stayed until the staff began clearing the tables around us. The walk back to the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. My building was 3 blocks away, and when we reached the corner where she should have said goodnight and turned toward wherever Carter was waiting for her, she didn't. "I could use a coffee," I said. My voice was steady. My hands were not. "So could I," said Jade. The elevator ride up felt different from every other elevator ride I'd ever taken in that building. We stood side by side in the mirrored box and I watched us in the reflection, the two of us, together, occupying the same small space, and thought, with perfect clarity, that I was about to make a choice. Not that something was happening to me, but that I was choosing. That distinction felt important. Then the elevator shuddered and stopped. The lights flickered once, twice, and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, a faint amber glow at floor level, and in the sudden dimness the space felt different. Smaller. The machinery hummed around us and somewhere below there was the distant sound of the building functioning without us. "Power surge," I said. "It happens sometimes. It'll pass." "Okay," said Jade. Her voice was even. Calm. In the amber half-light I could see the outline of her face, the shape of her in the small space. I could smell her perfume, something warm and complex, amber and wood smoke and something softer beneath it, and it was so close that it felt like a presence of its own. I don't know which of us moved first. I'm not sure it matters. What I know is that in the darkness of that elevator, with the machinery humming around us and the city going about its business somewhere below, my hand found her face. And she didn't pull away. The kiss was quiet. That's the word I keep coming back to when I think about it. Not timid, there was nothing timid about it, but quiet. Like a conversation that had been happening without words for 2 hours finally being spoken aloud. She made a small sound against my mouth and I felt it travel through me in a way that had nothing to do with reason or logic or any of the frameworks I'd spent 43 years constructing. When the lights came back on, we stepped apart. We didn't speak in the corridor. We didn't speak while I unlocked the door. We stood in my apartment in the familiar dark of the living room, the same room where, 11 days ago, I had found her with Carter, and the parallel was not lost on either of us. I could see it on her face when she looked around. The way her eyes traveled across the couch, the television, the space where everything had started. "Jade," I began. "Don't," she said softly. Not unkindly. Her fingers found my lips in the dark, a feather-light touch, the quietest possible gesture, and rested there for a moment. "Not yet. Let's just sit with it first." She left 20 minutes later. I stood at the closed door for a long time after the sound of her footsteps had faded, and then I sat down on the couch and I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. Not just the kiss. Not just the wanting. But the shape of what it meant. Who I was in this story. What I was doing. Carter. Carter, who called me every few weeks. Who showed up at my door easy and uncomplicated. Who was 23 years old and building his life and had no idea that his girlfriend had just kissed his stepmother in a broken elevator. I sat with that for a very long time. The next morning I was standing at my kitchen window watching the city wake up when my phone rang. It was Carter. "Hey," he said. "Are you home? Can I come over? I need to talk to you about something." 30 minutes later he was sitting across from me at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and his expression was the specific expression of someone who has decided to say something difficult and is in the process of making peace with that decision. "I know," he said. 2 words. No preamble. Just, "I know." The coffee mug in my hands became suddenly very interesting. "Carter. I'm not angry." He said it firmly, the way you say something you've rehearsed until you believe it. I want to be clear about that from the start. I'm not angry. "How did you?" She told me. He paused. Last night when she got home. She called me and she told me. The room was quiet. Outside, the city moved without caring about any of this. Carter, I'm so sorry. What happened between us was. Diane. He set his mug down. I said I'm not angry. I meant it. And I need you to let me finish before you apologize, because what I have to say is going to sound strange and I need you to hear all of it. I closed my mouth. He looked at his hands for a long moment, then back at me. Jade and I have been having some problems. Not dramatic ones, nothing you'd see from the outside, but real ones. We care about each other, but there's something between us that's been missing for a while and neither of us has known how to talk about it. She's been pulling away. I've felt it. I just didn't know what it meant. He paused again. Outside, a siren moved through the street below and faded. When she told me what happened last night, Carter continued, my first reaction was what you'd expect. But then, he stopped. Shook his head slightly. Then she told me how it happened. Not just that it happened, but how she felt. And something about hearing her talk about it, about you, something became clearer than it's been in months. Carter, I don't know what you're. I want to ask you something, he said. And I need you to not panic before you hear the whole question. I waited. There's a part of me, he said slowly, that wants to understand what this is between you and Jade. Not just accept it and move on, but understand it. And I've been sitting with a thought since last night that I can't shake. He met my eyes. I'd like you to invite Jade over. I'd like to be there. Not in the room, but nearby. I want to see what happens when the two of you are together without the pressure of pretending nothing exists between you. The silence that followed was the longest I'd experienced in years. I started. I know what it sounds like, he said quietly. I know. But hear me out. I'm not asking you to perform anything. I'm not asking anyone to do anything they don't want to do. I'm asking for honesty. Radical honesty. The kind we've never managed to have because we've all been too busy protecting each other. He looked at me steadily. Carter, who I had watched grow from a boy into this person across the table from me, had the particular stillness of someone who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Why? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because I think there's something real here that none of us knows how to name yet. And I think trying to pretend it doesn't exist is going to cost more than facing it. After he left, I sat at that kitchen table for most of the afternoon. I want to stop here for a second, because I know what some of you are thinking right now. I know the questions running through your mind, because they were running through mine. And I want you to know that this story doesn't end the way you might expect. There are no clean answers here. There's no moment where someone is purely the villain or purely the victim. What there is, what I found on the other side of the most complicated night of my life, is something that changed the way I understand myself completely. If you want to know where this goes, subscribe right now and turn on notifications because the second half of this story is what I wish someone had told me before I made every decision I'm about to describe. And drop a comment below, tell me, would you have done what Carter asked? Or would you have walked away? I read every single one. I called Jade that evening. She picked up on the second ring. He told me he was going to talk to you, she said. No greeting. Just that. He did, I said. A pause. Are you okay? It was such a simple question. Such an ordinary question. And it undid me slightly, the way ordinary things do when you're at the edge of something. I don't know, I said honestly. Are you? I've been better, she said. And then, quietly, I've also been worse. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about what Carter had proposed, not directly, not yet, but around it, the way you circle something you're not sure you want to touch. She talked about her relationship with Carter with the kind of careful honesty I'd come to expect from her, not brutal, but clear. She cared about him deeply. She didn't want to hurt him. But there was something in her that had been quietly suffocating for a long time, something she hadn't had the language for until recently. Recently meaning last night? I asked. Recently meaning the last few months, she said. Last night was just when it became impossible to ignore. I asked her what she wanted. Not what Carter wanted, not what made sense, not what caused the least damage, what she wanted. She was quiet for long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. I want to stop folding myself up, she said finally. 2 nights later, she came to my apartment for dinner. I had actually cooked, not ordered in, which is something I rarely do and which cost me the better part of the afternoon in concentration and mild panic. The apartment was clean. There were candles on the table, which I had put there and then second-guessed 3 times and ultimately left. Soft music, something instrumental, nothing with words, because words felt like too much of a statement. When the doorbell rang, I stood at the door for a moment before I opened it. Jade was wearing a cream-colored blouse and dark trousers, her hair pulled back loosely. She was holding a bottle of wine. She looked like she'd also spent time preparing for this, and the fact that we'd both prepared, that we'd both dressed carefully and thought about what to bring and arrived with our nerves tucked quietly behind our expressions, made the whole thing feel simultaneously more serious and more human. "You cooked," she said when she stepped inside and caught the smell. "I attempted to cook," I said. "Whether it qualifies as cooking is something we'll discover together." She laughed. The tension in the room shifted slightly. We ate slowly. We talked more easily than I'd expected, about her current work, a series of large-scale pieces she was developing around the theme of visibility and concealment, about a trip she'd taken years ago to Portugal that had changed how she thought about color, about a book I'd been reading that she'd read too and had strong feelings about. The wine helped. The candles helped. The fact that we had already kissed helped in ways that were hard to articulate. It removed a particular kind of pretending, replaced it with a different kind of honesty. It was after the meal, sitting together on the couch with our wine glasses and the city glittering outside the window, that the conversation went somewhere quieter. She told me she'd known for years that she was attracted to women. Not exclusively, but genuinely, in a way she'd never found safe passage to explore. She'd grown up in a household where it simply wasn't a possibility, not something discussed or acknowledged or offered as real. By the time she was old enough to make her own choices, she'd already built a life that didn't have obvious space for that part of herself, and so she kept folding it up, the way she'd said, putting it away, making herself fit. And then, she said quietly, "You opened your door." I set my wine glass down. "Jade. I'm not saying it as a blame," she said quickly. "I'm saying it as a fact. Something shifted when I saw the way you looked at me that night. I'd never had someone look at me that way before. And I didn't know what to do with it." "How did I look at you?" I asked. Because I genuinely needed to know. She considered it for a moment. Like I was something worth looking at. I reached across the space between us and took her hand. What happened next was not impulsive. That's the thing I need you to understand. It was the opposite of impulsive. It was the end of a long, slow, deliberate arrival, 2 people who had spent 11 days and 2 conversations and 40 minutes on the phone working their way toward something that neither of them had chosen so much as recognized. The recognition was what it felt like. Not discovery. Recognition. We kissed on the couch where Carter had kissed her. The symmetry of it was not lost on me. The couch, the apartment, the shifting light, all of it the same, and all of it completely different. What I didn't know, until later, was that Carter was there. Not in the room. Down the hall, in the doorway of the second bedroom, the one I used as an office, which I had left unlocked. He had let himself in with his key while we were eating dinner, moving quietly enough that neither of us had heard him. He positioned himself where he could see without being seen, and he watched. He told me about it afterward, sitting at my kitchen table in the early hours of the morning, all three of us awake and stunned and working through something none of us had a map for. He told me without defensiveness or apology, with the same measured honesty he'd brought to every conversation we'd had about this from the beginning. I needed to see it, he said. Not to confirm anything or to catch anyone. I needed to see what it looked like when she was fully herself. Because I've never seen that. In 8 months, I've never seen that. Jade was quiet across the table. She wasn't angry. She looked like someone processing something large. And, she said finally. Carter was quiet for a moment. And it was the saddest and most beautiful thing I've ever watched, he said. Because I realized I haven't been able to give you that. And I've been trying. The three of us sat with that for a while. There's a version of this story that ends there. The version where Carter and Jade have a painful, honest conversation and go their separate ways, and I retreat into my apartment and my work and try to figure out what the last 2 weeks have done to my understanding of myself, and eventually all three of us come out on the other side of it, tender and adjusted. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and stranger and more human than any of us had planned for. The conversation at the kitchen table lasted until nearly 4 a.m. We talked about things I've never discussed with another living person, about longing and selfishness and the difference between love that possesses and love that allows. Carter talked about what it had been like to grow up watching his father fail at marriage and his determination not to repeat it. Jade talked about the years of folding herself up. I talked about the divorce, about Robert, about the particular loneliness of being in a relationship that had simply run out of substance while everyone around you assumed everything was fine. We were honest with each other in the way people rarely manage to be, not cruelly, not as a weapon, but as a kind of offering. Here is the truth of me. You can do whatever you need to do with it. By the time the city outside was beginning to go from dark to that particular blue-gray that precedes dawn, something had shifted between the three of us. Not resolved, nothing as simple as that. But shifted. Like furniture rearranged in a room, the same pieces in a different configuration, the light hitting differently because of it. In the weeks that followed, we found our way into something I still don't entirely have the language for. Not a conventional relationship, nothing that would fit into any framework I'd encountered before. Carter and Jade's romantic relationship changed, evolved, became something more honest than it had been and in some ways more fragile and in other ways more durable. Jade and I moved slowly into something that had its own texture, its own particular way of being, built on those long conversations, on art and coffee and the way she could make me see something in a painting I'd looked at a dozen times and never actually seen. Carter and I stayed what we'd always been, more or less. The person who had grown up partly because of me. The person who called every few weeks. Except now there was a layer of realness to it that hadn't been there before, a honesty that had been purchased at considerable cost and that neither of us was willing to squander. It was not without difficulty. I want to be clear about that. There were nights when the weight of it felt like too much, when the complexity of what we'd built seemed like hubris, like three people who had talked themselves into believing they could manage something that would simply collapse eventually under the pressure of its own strangeness. There were mornings when I lay awake and ran the tape of every choice that had led me here and wondered what a saner, simpler version of me would have done differently. Walked away from the gallery. Declined the rooftop bar. Not opened her door when she came for dinner. But then I'd think about what Jade had said in her apartment, in the long quiet of one of those evenings when we'd talked until we'd forgotten what time it was, that the most expensive thing she'd ever done was fold herself up. That the cost of containment is paid slowly, in increments so small you don't notice until the debt is enormous. I don't think I'm a cautionary tale. I don't think I'm a success story either. I think I'm a person who came home a day early and found something she wasn't looking for, and chose to look at it instead of away from it, and has been living with the consequences, the complicated, sometimes painful, sometimes extraordinary consequences, ever since. What I know now that I didn't know then is that desire is not the same as choice. Desire is what happens to you. Choice is what you do with it. And the most important choices are rarely the dramatic ones, the kiss, the invitation, the night that changes everything. The most important choices are the smaller ones that come after. Whether to be honest. Whether to stay in the room. Whether to let someone see you fully, knowing they might find something there you haven't made peace with yourself. Carter, if he ever reads this, which he won't because he doesn't watch this kind of thing and I've been careful about details, I don't know if we did the right thing. I don't know if right and wrong are even the right categories for what happened between us. What I know is that we were honest with each other when it would have been much easier not to be, and that the honesty cost something and gave something in return, and that I would rather have paid that cost than lived on the other side of the easier choice, comfortable and contained and quietly disappearing. And Jade who paints large canvases about visibility and concealment, who told me once that the best paintings are the ones that make you feel seen without being able to say exactly why. Jade showed me something about myself that I'd been folding up for a very long time. I'm still unfolding it. That's probably how it will be for a while. But I'm done folding. If this story reached into something in you, if it touched a place you've been trying not to look at, I want to hear from you. Right now, in the comments below, tell me one thing you've been folding up. You don't have to explain it or justify it. Just name it. One thing. Because there is something about putting words to the things we keep quiet that makes them smaller and more manageable, and the space, these conversations we have here, are the reason I keep coming back and keep sharing things I never imagined I'd say out loud. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Turn on notifications. Come back next week, because the next story I'm going to tell you is one that took me 3 years to be ready to speak, and it starts with a phone call I almost didn't answer. I'll see you there.